And now we're going to continue our day with the next panel. They're going to delve into the topic of conservation and indigenous peoples. To lead this discussion, we're fortunate to have with us Vince McElhinny, who is the Senior Director of Social Policy and Practice Department at Conservation International, who's one of our major sponsors. Vince?
Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to participate in this discussion, hopefully continuing in line with the fine presentations we saw yesterday and this morning. We have the pleasure of organizing a panel on conservation and indigenous peoples. We have two esteemed presenters who I'm going to introduce and invite to the panel. The first is Yance Arizona. Yance is the Executive Director of the Epistema Institute in Indonesia, a think tank that promotes research-based advocacy related to natural resources and indigenous issues. In addition to being a lecturer in jurisprudence at the Law Department at President University and the Gentera School of Law, Yance was awarded from Conservation International an Indigenous Leader Conservation Fellowship that supported his activities to explore conflict between the state and customary law pertaining to communities' control over customary forest, which will be the focus of his presentation today. In addition to several master's degrees in law and natural resource management, Yance will be initiating his own doctoral studies at Leiden University next year. So I'd like to invite Yance to the stage. Our second speaker is Dr. Peter Herlihy, who's a professor of geography from the University of Kansas. Peter is an award-winning teacher and researcher whose work focuses on the study of lands and peoples in Latin America and with a particular focus in Central America, and as it relates to the establishment and management of protected areas and indigenous peoples' territory. Peter has research ongoing that focuses on participatory research mapping with indigenous peoples in Central America, and his presentation is going to be focusing on an ongoing Bowman expedition in collaboration with between the University of Kansas and the American Geographical Society to advance this work. So I'd like to invite Peter to the platform. So to frame our panel discussion this morning, I'd like to just make a few remarks that give some indication of where our discussion is going to be heading. Conservation work, as many of you may know, continues to evolve toward a full partnership between conservation advocates and indigenous peoples. In this regard, this work has learned many lessons, and the notion of how we work in collaboration with people who, in fact, have established superior conservation techniques for ages is one that is not only essential, but complicated. Our work reflects the lessons learned in striking the right balance between within that partnership. Our panel will explain why this work is essential going forward. If we want to be relevant in climate change, but also want to be a rights-based actor in the world of conservation, which is what I'll say in a few remarks regarding our work at Conservation International. I should say, by the way, that our third panelist, Dr. Myrna Cunningham, is unable to join us, unfortunately, and in that regard, I'll make a few remarks about the work of Conservation International at the end. Some of the challenges that our panelists are going to be focusing on in terms of establishing this partnership involve land tenure. Land rights are at the center of this work. 65% of the global land surface is claimed by indigenous peoples and local communities as land that they've occupied and have some authority over. Only 20% of this land actually is recognized as theirs. Closing that gap is one of the core priorities going forward. It's estimated that 50% of all protected areas worldwide are established on lands that are occupied by indigenous peoples. Sorting out this arrangement in a way that it acknowledges that the rights of indigenous peoples are respected in this regard is also one of those challenges. The issue of carbon rights has emerged as also one of the core challenges of acknowledging that indigenous peoples have an essential role to play in the nature-based solutions that are essential to getting to 2 or 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's a lot of work that has to be done in order to establish how carbon rights are going to be acknowledged and awarded. And finally, as has been indicated perhaps in some of the earlier sessions, the criminalization of environmental activists has also become a phenomenon that is a consequence of pushing hard in some of these areas for justice. And we should acknowledge that across the world, there's been a spike in the number of environmental activists, both within the indigenous communities and outside of them, that have become endemic to this work. We're also going to hear about solutions. So some of these involve the work that Peter and Yance are going to be explaining at the level of the community, where participatory mapping and putting information in the hands of communities to defend their rights is an essential component of moving forward, as well as the policy solutions that Yance is going to be discussing that institutionalize acknowledgement of rights and the benefits of that. And then finally, building the negotiation capacity of these actors in a way that occurs as this week winds up in Marrakesh at the global level in the context of the climate negotiations, but at the very local level as well in terms of establishing and building capacity to define and win durable solutions that acknowledge land rights for indigenous peoples. It becomes part of the work that we do. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to our first speaker. Yance from the Epistema Institute is going to give us our first presentation. I'd like to just ask you to come to the mic.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Vince, to introduce me. First of all, I would like to say thank you to Professor Price to invite me to be a speaker in this symposiums, and also to Juha and GF to sponsor my participation. Yes, I would like to share about the Indonesia experience. We already heard before about the bad experience about the, from the Global Forest Watch about the forest fire last year. Maybe this is going to be a good news for the struggle of the indigenous peoples to gain the indigenous territory. Yes. Yes, I come from Jakarta. This is Jakarta in Indonesia. Indonesia consists of, Indonesia is the largest, just for introduction for you. Indonesia is the largest archipelago state, consists of more than 17,000 islands, 300 ethnicity, 700 language, and 2/3 of the Indonesian territory covered by sea, by waters. And Indonesia located between 2 continents and also between 2 oceans. So geographically it's very strategic. From Jakarta, I traveled to Jeddah, 10 hours. It takes 10 hours. And then from Jeddah, I traveled to New York, here, 13.5 hours. So maybe I am the farthest participant here it took almost 24 hours in the airplane to come to New York, and also and hope my participation in this symposium going to be give the positive contribution, because it's very the opposite of the U.S. experience, I guess. Also in terms of time, right now it's 10 a.m. in U.S. In Indonesia it's 10 p.m. So it's evening in Indonesia. Yes, I'll come back to about Indonesia. I will start with the forest sector. Forestry sector is very important when talking about natural resources and also indigenous peoples' rights in Indonesia, because forest area in Indonesia cover almost 70% of Indonesian land. It's around 124 million hectares. So almost 70% of Indonesian land is forest area. Forest area is not only tree, you know. In Indonesia, forest area is different with forest. Forest consists of tree, but forest area is a land, a particular land that determined by the government as a forest. So even there is no tree there, it's going to be a forest as well, as long as the government determine that area is forest. And another problem within the forest area is the exclusive control of the forest by the governments. This is a colonial legacy. In the forestry, they said this is a scientific forestry, or maybe if you know about what they call the German school of forestry. This principle basically believe that the only state then can manage forest properly. So the only state that can manage forest properly. This is based on the state-owned forests. So if there is a communities, indigenous peoples, living within or surrounding forest area, they must be exploited out. They are treated the forest area. That is the problem in Indonesia. However, there are almost 30% of village in Indonesia exist within and surrounding forest area. So they are very vulnerable. Most of them are indigenous communities. 10 million of them are poor because they have very limited access to forests. And how about indigenous communities? We have the constitutional provision to recognize indigenous peoples, but it has certain limitations. The first is the existence of the indigenous people should be fulfill certain conditions. First, they must be proven exist. There must be accordant with societal developments, and there must be not contradict with the principle of the unitary states of Indonesia. So when we're talking about indigenous peoples in Indonesia, it's quite different when we're talking about indigenous people here in US, in Canada, in Latin America, or in Australia. Because in those countries you can consider indigenous people using the racial-based approach to determine who are indigenous and who are not indigenous peoples. But in Indonesia, in many parts of Asia and also Africa, it's quite difficult to determine who are indigenous peoples. And the Indonesian legal systems require district regulations to determine who are indigenous peoples. So for every communities, they must have the special district regulations mentioning and determine they are indigenous peoples. So the lack of the constitutional recognition gives the impact that criminalizations. So they are really vulnerable. There's a data in 2015, it's around 129 of indigenous persons criminalized, put in facing a legal problem, put in the jail to the court. And also about the human rights abuse, and a lot of problem related to forest area. And indigenous peoples organization in Indonesia, the biggest indigenous people organization in Indonesia, we call it AMAN. Aman estimated that the number of indigenous peoples in Indonesia is around 50 to 70 millions. The main struggle of indigenous communities in Indonesia is to struggle for recognition of the legal status as indigenous communities, and also related to struggle of our territory, including traditional knowledge to manage the territory. And even Aman, as the biggest indigenous people organization, has a motto. This is motto when the inaugural Congress of Aman in 1999, they said that if the state doesn't recognize us as indigenous peoples, then we will not recognize the states. So the struggle to get recognition is the main discourse about indigenous issues in Indonesia, including recognition of the indigenous territory. There are some indigenous initiatives to conservation in Indonesia. This is, I just show you two examples. First is from Amatoa Kajang. This is in South Celebes. These communities living in the forest, they use different, very distinct culture and distinct appearance as well, distinct dress. So they're always using the black dress. I think you can find as well in some parts in Latin America, community like this. And also the other example is in Central Moluccas. So it's quite unique because in Central Moluccas, the indigenous territory is not only indigenous land, but also indigenous sea. So they not only map the land, but also they also map the sea as a part of the indigenous territory. And then under the sea, they make customary traditional conservations by, they call it sasi. Sasis mean prohibition. Prohibition to catch the fish for certain periods. And then after that, they will make the ceremony, and then they come together to the sea to catch the fish together, and then they will do it frequently over years. Facing this problem, the lack of constitutional recognition, the indigenous communities come to the constitutional court to claim the rights of the customary forest. This case quite similar. If you're familiar with the indigenous people's issue, maybe you will know about our Stingy case. This is a case that handled by Mirna Cunningham, and also a Mabo case in Australia. How the court recognized, granted the indigenous people's rights. And yes, the Constitutional Court says that because the indigenous territory already occupied by the state forest area, so the state should be given back the forest area to the indigenous communities. So that is the main point of the Constitutional Court decisions. But to give back the indigenous territory to indigenous community, there should be made there should make district regulation. So they're using district regulation as legal instruments to recognize the indigenous territory. So since 2013 until now, there are 60 district regulations created. So my organization working to advise, to encourage district governments to create the district regulation to recognize indigenous peoples and also their territory. To make a district regulation, you need two aspects. The first is social mapping, and the second is community participatory mapping. What is social mapping? Social mapping is a description about the history, the number of the communities, the traditional knowledge, the customary institutions. And the second is a community participatory mapping to identify the border of the indigenous territory. So community participatory mapping is part to recognize indigenous territory to gain the district regulation. And also after the Constitutional Court decision, this is a massive movement in Indonesia. After the Constitutional Court decision number 35, 2013, some of indigenous people make a signpost in their forest, customary forest, mention that according to the Constitutional Court decision number 35, customary forest is no longer state forest area. So the state must be given back to the indigenous communities. Yeah, the participatory mapping is very important in this movement. This is a data collected by Indigenous Territory Registration Agency, indicated that so far community participatory mapping in Indonesia already mapped 7.3 million hectares of indigenous territory. So it's quite huge. It's equal with the size of Panama, already mapped by indigenous communities, for 942 sites. Unfortunately, it's only around 180,000 hectares already recognized through district regulation. So it's still long to go to gain all of the map recognized by the states. So they have a motto to map their own territory. They call, let us map our own ancestral land before it is mapped by others. So we have to have initiative to map in ancestral land before it's mapped by logging concession, oil palm company, or forest agencies. And there are two main organizations working with this, Participatory Mapping Working Network, and also Indigenous Territory Registration Agency. So it's quite unique because this agency is not state-based agency, because the state doesn't provide a service to register the indigenous territory, so the NGO create their own registration agency. So this is an NGO-based agency to register the indigenous territory. This, for instance, in Borneo, in Kalimantan, this is a spot of the indigenous territory already mapped. This is in the west Borneo, and yes, for the and they give the information, basic information about the territory, the border of the indigenous territory, and also the history. Current policy reform ongoing in Indonesia. Right now, the Parliament initiated the bill on the recognition of indigenous people's rights, also the bill pertaining land, and also the proposal to put a special chapter related to indigenous land, and also the bill related to forestry, and also the last one is the bill on biodiversity conservation. It's very related with this topic. In this bill, the biodiversity will be separated into three. The first is genetic biodiversity, species biodiversity, and ecosystem biodiversity. And this bill going to be give the authority to the Ministry of Forestry and Environment to determine the conservation area, including the indigenous communities conserved areas, or we call it ICCES, also initiated in many countries, I guess. But in some place in Indonesia, indigenous community feel suspicious to term conservations, because term conservations come from outside of the communities, and it could be restrict the access of the indigenous communities as well. However, if we compare with the production extractive area and conservation area, it's quite possible to gain recognition for indigenous peoples in Indonesia when they overlap with the conservation area rather than in concession area. So there is a there's a common platform about the conservation between the conservation agenda and also indigenous people agenda. And you know that indigenous people are also a main actor in the climate change as well, in forest protection as well. I will end up with this last slides. I think from Indonesian experience, there are at least 3 points that have to be discussed. The first is how to integrate indigenous territory into the formal map. Right now in Indonesia, there is an initiative from national governments to create one map policy. So one map policy, it means there's only one map. Everything, including forests, minings, indigenous peoples, to reduce overlapping maps in Indonesia. And the second is how to create accessible procedure to recognize indigenous peoples, because using district regulation to recognize indigenous peoples is quite, it's not accessible. It's very political, takes time, it's quite difficult. And the last is how to protect and promote indigenous peoples' communities' concert areas and practice in the future. So that's my presentation, Vince. Thank you.
So moving now from Asia, Indonesia in particular, to Latin America, I'll invite Dr. Herlihy to tell us a little bit about his ongoing work in Central America on working on participatory research mapping. Dr. Herlihy.
Good morning, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to present. I have basically 2 missions here. One is to tell you about the Bowman expedition, the American Geographical Society, University of Kansas Bowman expedition to Central America, and to show you how that type of a project, the Bowman expeditions, can be incredibly useful to analyze these exact types of issues on the ground. This is a Bowman expedition to Central America. We're funded by a Minerva Initiative grant from the U.S. Department of Defense. This is the project website, and you can see the website address there if you want to look at it. We are in our 4th year of funding from Minerva, and what you will see here is in the process of analysis. And I want to point out that this is work that is being done by university students, and Jerry Dobson and myself as the academic PI and co-PI in this project. And I think it demonstrates the utility of this type of work. And while our monitoring and measuring of land cover change and forest change in the world is at a metadata level and requires enormously sophisticated computers to analyze it, a lot of the real solutions, as I'll show you here, are on the ground. So we work in a fairly large collaboration to study Central America and the indigenous people of Central America. We form a collaboration with the universities. We're working on the ground in 3 countries. We're working in all 7 Central American countries, but we're working on the ground in 3, where we have in Guatemala the University of San Carlos, in Honduras the Pedagógica, and the National University in Costa Rica. And you can see that we collaborate with a lot of different international organizations, the World Bank, the United Nations, local NGOs, the German cooperation, GIZ. And in the project, if you can read that small number down there, there are 124 people that work with us. Now, there's just really 2 professors. There's about a dozen students, and the rest are what we call and train local geographers. The overall theme of the Central American Indígena Bowman expedition is the project investigates the geographic factors that promote stability, instability, and resilience in indigenous communities of Central America. You can see, from the statistics here, we're talking about 6 million people in an area that has 7 countries and 36 million people. We process, and I'd like to point this out, all of our own data. Like you can see the census information with the dates. We go to every country, we collect information, the most confident information and correct information that can be found, and then we process it into our original database. Central America has about 80 different indigenous people. Not real large numbers, but they cover 40% of Central America. And if we're talking, in the second message beyond the Bowman expedition is that if we're talking about conservation, protected areas, and land cover change, and we're not talking about indigenous people, we're missing the message. And I'll show the examples of that here in Central America. We work at 2 scales. At the level of Central America, we work at the municipality level, which is like a county. There are 1,216 counties, if you will, municipios in Central America. And at the regional level, we fill the polygons of the municipios with the data. So we have 1,216 polygons throughout Central America. We learn and if you want, kind of classify and understand that information through our on-the-ground participatory research mapping. And we have 3 sites, one in Zacatepeques, which is actually Antigua, Guatemala. It's beautiful there, up in the highlands, the volcanic highlands. Another one out in the eastern edges of Honduras in the Mosquite area. And another one in Alto Chiripo in Costa Rica, which is an indigenous area up in the Talamanca. And also, we have ongoing analysis of work that we've done in the Darien without field study on the ground. This is participatory research mapping. We invented it. In 1992, in Honduras, we did the first participatory mapping in all of Latin America and maybe in the world. And we've been continuing since 1992 to develop it, to refine it, to put in new technologies and understanding. It basically is a process. I don't know the pointer here, does this? Yeah. It begins with community approval, works with selecting local investigators that we train to do the on-the-ground field work. We basically collect cognitive information through the form of questionnaires and sketch maps that come from the indigenous people and local people. It's not just indigenous people, local people's minds. And then we put this into a GIS. They are trained in the use of GPS units, and they use notebooks to collect and record this information. And then we work with them to map and to pass this into shapefiles and ultimately into a standard map. We are very different in the way we do this as geographers. We're geographers, and we invented this, and we standardize this information. And we work with the National Geographic Institutes in all the countries so that they publish this information afterwards. So it takes a mental map that we all know about, cognitive maps, and it converts it to a consensual map. We could all maybe map a part of campus here, a little part that we've seen. But if we put all of our knowledge together on one table, all of that consensual, mental, cognitive knowledge, we could probably draw a pretty good sketch map of campus. Even those of us that don't live here, we can add something to it. And so we work together like that, and then we put it with the information that you need to standardize this into the cartography. It's an iterative process. Without going into all this detail, you can see that we develop the cartography and the GIS for bases to work with. We train people in workshops to do local geography. We do the field work and we work with them, but the people themselves go out to the communities and collect this information. And then we do an analysis and workshop. And then it comes back to us, but it's not done, it's not accurate, it's not correct. And usually it requires a cycle, an iterative process of three times, more or less, to get it to the caliber of precision and accuracy that we're looking for. We take this information and then we put it on various platforms. You can see here, these are static images that we put on ArcGIS online once we develop these maps. And we do this so that the local people can use this. That's a big issue in terms of how do we get the information to the local people. They can't and never will, at this particular juncture, be able to operate a ArcGIS. But they can easily operate Google Map. And so we do an analysis. This is showing the resource analysis that provides nodal resource use, defines functional habitats, shows where people use resources, where and these are our local geographers. This was on an automatic slideshow, but these are the local geographers that result from this. We've trained almost nearly 100 that know how to work with cartography, with maps, with compasses, with questionnaires to do the reunions and the meetings. And these people stay as local resources for the communities, and they understand the maps, and they understand how to use GPS and locate the problematic on the ground, not quite as remotely. But to get those, and we've been doing this in Honduras, the indigenous people will go out and get a GPS point, and then we help them to put it in the GIS and throw a map out, and they use this for policy and decision making. There have been enormous changes in Central America. We talk a lot here about protected areas, but I have not heard one discussion of the indigenous territorial jurisdictions that exist around the planet today. In Central America, there are almost 1,200 indigenous territorial jurisdictions. And these are territories that indigenous people are getting property, title to. And there is an enormous, as you will see, overlap with the protected areas. So that if you're talking about protected area management, you really have to talk about indigenous territorial jurisdictions. We finished 8 of these territorial jurisdictions here in the Mosquitia, mapping about 6,000 square kilometers at the very detailed, precise level of 1 to 50,000. So we have done that work out here. The World Bank and other collaborators are actually asking us to continue. And we're concluding this area in the Department of Zacatepeques in Guatemala and also in Costa Rica. We're mapping on the ground about 10,000 square kilometers at a very large scale with an enormous detail. At the level of Central America, basically we're filling these polygons. We collect different types of information, and I want to emphasize that I'm doing an analysis here of protected areas and conservation in Central America for this talk, but this is a database that we're constructing for all types of different use and applications, and it's already being used that way. So we have around 20 variables right now for all of Central America. It requires studying every single local census and doing an analysis of the variables and the polygons, and it's a very long and agonizing process to just get one variable across the whole area, but now we have about 20. So here we'll use this database to look at Central America and look at the indigenous influence in conservation and protected areas. And I might add that when Marie was so nice to invite me to give a talk here, we really had not done any of this. So it shows you the power of the GIS database for doing an assessment. So here we have indigenous people, the self-identified indigenous people in the municipal boundaries, and you can see there's enormous areas. About 40% of Central America is indigenous areas, and some of them, have an enormously high percentage of, where it's really dark green, of indigenous people. Then we put in, and this again requires going through every single country and the coverages and information. We took the protected areas of every single Central American country, and then we took the indigenous territorial jurisdictions and we overlapped them. And you can see very simply that there's a lot of overlap. I've studied this stuff for quite a while, and in 1990, there were only 250 protected areas in Central America, and 75 of them, only 75 of the 250 had indigenous people in them. But those 75 accounted for 85% of the area of protected areas in Central America. The patterns have changed because the countries in Central America have signed the International Labor Organization Treaty, which recognizes the rights of indigenous peoples to have their lands, not just lands that the community is in, but lands that the communities use. So there are international treaties that give an enormous respalda, backing, for the indigenous people throughout Central America. So you can see this overlap between the indigenous territorial jurisdictions, the green polygons, and the protected areas. We also put on forest cover to look at this analysis. This is the global forest cover that comes out of USGS that we've applied to Central America and done reclassifications of it to make it really conform to the on-the-ground reality. We also have shown the forest loss out of the University of Maryland. There is a 2010 to 2014 year period where they've done forest loss change analysis. And so what you see here, and will for the remainder of the slides, is that forest loss. It's over a 14-year period. So that red represents the moving up into the Petén, up in this area of Guatemala, to the Mosquitia over here, in Honduras and in Nicaragua. And you notice also that it's not as prevalent in lower Central America and down here in Darien. So we'll look at two quick case examples as I wind down this presentation. We'll look first at the Mosquitia area of eastern Honduras, and just to get a sense of what this area is like. This is the largest forest corridor in all of Central America, and I've been very fortunate professionally to work with the governments and the international community to make these protected areas and to develop them. So I have a card in the game, so to speak, and I should be very, supportive of protected areas, but you're gonna see there are a lot of issues here with protected areas. So this is the Mosquitia. This is the famous Contra Sandinista trail between Honduras and Nicaragua, right at the borderlands, in the heart of this enormous forested corridor. It contains some of the most endangered animals that still survive, beautiful harpy eagles and jaguars that roam through the forest. There also are indigenous people in this forest that are not visible from remote sensing, from satellite imagery. You're not going to see their influence under the canopy, which is where their life occurs. They live in small communities, usually along one side of the river. This is the Toaca community where I actually lived years ago. And there are 5 different ethnic groups in this corridor. This is the other most prominent one, the Mosquito, who Myrna Cunningham, if she had been here with us, is a member of. And they live mostly in coastal communities along the edge, but use the forest in the interior. They're subsistence agriculturalists that use hunting and fishing to supplement their diet. But there is an enormous colonization front that you saw in red confronting all these indigenous areas where hundreds to thousands of people are flocking into these areas on a daily basis, just taking over lands and land grabbing, if you will, and causing environmental destruction, which puts a very different image on the landscape. So let's look just now at the area of Mosquitia. These are just simple polygons of the protected areas. That's the Rio Platano. This is the Tuaca area. This is the Parque Nacional Patuca. This is the famous Bosawas. So this is the largest protected area corridor in Central America. And I had the good fortune to work developing this. But look at this, the front, the colonization front. These reserves were established in 1990. And now the Tuaca Reserve, it's almost unmanageable in terms of conservation. The same with the Parque Nacional Patuca. But if you look at the new indigenous territorial jurisdictions, you don't see quite exactly the same pattern. You see that there is very little, there is deforestation in here, but it's a result, and there are exceptions. In this area up here to the north, which was a penetration area, and down here in Nicaragua, this is where the road goes to Puerto Cabezas, along this area, where there are areas that are problematic. But overall, there's a much higher level of conservation of forest in the protected areas. If we look at lower Central America, it's the same pattern. If you overlap the protected areas with the indigenous territorial jurisdictions, you begin to see the enormous overlap. And when you look at this, you also notice these are the protected area polygons. You notice that Costa Rica, which has a fama for this, is famous for its conservation and protection, and Panama have done a much better job protecting the forest. But still, when you look at the indigenous territorial jurisdictions and the enormous overlap, you see a much stronger pattern of conservation in the indigenous areas. If you look at the Darien, which is an area that I've worked in my entire professional life, you see the exact same pattern. This is this area in here, this is the border with Colombia, and this is the Darien National Park. And this is well protected. But look at the indigenous areas here. This is one of the most active colonization fronts in Central America. The Pan-American Highway was opened into this department of Darien in 1980. And all this deforestation here has occurred since 1980. Most of it between 1980 and 1983, in a 4-year period. Then they established these indigenous territorial jurisdictions. They're called comarcas. And look at this area in here. The indigenous territorial jurisdictions, they have legal control. The indigenous people own these lands now. This is a tremendous change that's only occurred over the last decade, where because of the international treaties, because of the ILO agreement, because of the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, and because of the constitutions of almost every single Central American country that recognizes the rights of indigenous people to their lands, well, this is the result. If you give people their lands and their titles, they're going to manage them. Well, this is just a summary. I'm winding down. I have just one more slide after this. You'll be happy to know. This is the overall picture, and it's still preliminary because I promise you we've been struggling to put this presentation together over the last month or so. But this is the pattern that we see. If you look at the land area of Central America, you have roughly 506,000 square kilometers. The protected area covers about 33%, 34% of that area. And if you look at protected area here, you notice that if you look at the forested area in the protected areas, it's only 80%. If you're looking at a protected area, these are all the almost 1,200. It's funny, there are almost 1,200 indigenous territorial jurisdictions and almost 1,200 protected areas in Central America. There's just been a bloom of protected areas and indigenous territorial jurisdictions over the last decade. But if you look at that, it indicates that not all the protected areas are forested. And look at the rate of loss. 7.1% over the last 14 years has been deforested. However, if you go to the indigenous territories, you see a little different pattern. You have almost 17% of Central America under indigenous territorial jurisdictions. And I might add that there is an enormous overlap that we're trying to get at quantitatively and understand better between the indigenous areas and the protected areas. But look at this. Okay, inside the indigenous territorial jurisdictions, only 73% of it is forested. But they're keeping that forest. Look at the change, only 4% as opposed to 7%. The indigenous territorial jurisdictions, while they're not set up primarily for conservation, the indigenous people conserve their forest better. So what are the conclusions that we can draw from this? Well, first is that indigenous populations are stewards, guardians, and now owners of most of the forest and important natural resources in Central America. Indigenous leaders and their legal federations have expressed, and I'd like to really pass this message to you, disdain for protected areas and conservation. Yance mentioned this in his study, but they've formally declared they don't want to hear on their lands about protected areas. They believe that they can establish their own protected areas and manage their own lands under their own traditions the way they always have. And this is formal policy across Central America, and the indigenous peoples have the rights to say it. And so state governments are changing their approaches, trying to. In Central America, indigenous territorial jurisdictions, indigenous communities plan to manage and protect their own environment. That's the same point. And then finally, national and international governments and NGOs will have to work with indigenous populations to manage this regional biodiversity. And if they don't, it won't happen. Thanks.
And in the absence of Dr. Cunningham, I'm going to just say a few things about CI's work, which I hope is perceived as following very much in line with the presentations that we just heard. So CI's mission is to build upon a strong foundation of science, partnership, and field demonstration to empower all society to responsibly and sustainably care for nature, our biodiversity, and the well-being of humanity. CI works has offices in over 25 countries and investments underway in over 30. CI is one of the first organizations, at least environmental organizations, to develop a policy for partnership with indigenous peoples. And Conservation International, through its own policy commitments, ensures respect for indigenous peoples' rights in all of our work. We do this by ensuring the recognition of communal lands and build indigenous peoples' capacity to adapt to a changing climate. Among the other types of investments we make, one of which is this annual fellowship, which this is the 5th year of it, will be announced in December, where we offer several fellowships to indigenous leaders to explore solutions to the impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. One example on our early work was with the Kayapó in the Xingu region of Pará, Brazil, Mato Grosso and Pará, Brazil, with an investment at the time, probably about 20 years ago, of about $5 million. CI was able to help leverage other investments to help the Kayapó secure their land rights and to enforce and survey encroachment on their lands over time. It strengthened the Kayapó and NGOs' community governance and to promote alternative livelihoods, and it's continued to attract additional investment from Brazilian actors to sustainably finance their activities. As a result, among the other examples we've already seen, and the point we'll continue to kind of insist, is the Kayapo have successfully managed their land in a way that's superior not only to the encroachment of unsustainable agricultural activities around it, but superior to many traditional protected areas. And so, as Peter and Yance have both suggested, there is a model here that we need to learn from. We feel that the model that was piloted with the Kayapo, in partnership with the Kayapo, can be scaled up across biomes, across larger areas like the Amazon. The potential for this is significant. As Peter suggested in Central America, the same is true for the Amazon. The Kayapo experience potentially impacts 20% of unprotected indigenous territory across the Amazon. Indigenous territory in the Amazon basin is the equivalent of the combined emissions in terms of carbon storage of the 10 top global economies. The main obstacles to locking in these and other essential services that indigenous territory provide to the population of the Amazon and to the world involve things like land tenure. So this is not only a problem and a potential solution for places like Indonesia, like Central America, like the Amazon basin, but for the world. 20% of the habitable planet and vast ocean areas are under indigenous or other local community control and stewardship. These areas hold vast reservoirs of natural capital that are essential to our future. Indigenous people and local communities have safeguarded these places, as I've said, in a way that not only is significant, but superior to many ways that we as conservation organizations have attempted to promote in traditional protected areas. Forest conservation is 1/3 of the climate mitigation solution as we estimated at CI. But for that 30% of the solution of getting to 1.5 degrees, possibly as little as 2% of the overall climate finance is dedicated to these activities. It's closing that commitment to fund the things that we know to work that is going to be essential going forward. And stewardship of these natural systems by engaged and empowered communities will determine not only their own well-being, but our own, all of ours. So the global opportunity is, and in citing studies that have been done by our colleagues from WRI, which I'm going to cite on numerous slides, and I'll thank in advance, and RRI, Rights and Resources Initiative, among others, indicate that there's a huge reserve of natural capital, of carbon, of other essential services that are potentially significant for protecting not only for those populations, but for the global economy. Yet 500 million people who depend on forests live in poverty, and many of these are indigenous peoples. So by investing in local stewardship of natural systems, we can directly benefit these communities and protect billions in global capital for our own benefit. So the way that CI approaches this is very much grounded in a rights-based approach. Our work is founded on a framework of 6 rights-based policies that guide everything that we do, including things like a gender policy, which strives for gender equity in all of our work, and a policy with Indigenous peoples partnership that involves FPIC guidelines, among others. Our work is in partnership with communities to unlock traditional knowledge and customary ways of protecting their natural resources that we often don't understand for sometimes very good reasons, but has, when used appropriately, has significant benefit for the rest, many of the solutions that we're trying to promote. But it involves empowering communities to determine how and when and in what context that traditional knowledge can be shared. As I mentioned earlier, another of the programs that CI promotes is inviting leaders to submit proposals for how their own research can be supported, primarily to the benefit of their own communities, but often to the benefit of the world. And so in the picture is one of our conservation fellows, Hindu Ibrahim from the Lake Chad area, who has worked with pastoral communities in Chad to identify the impacts of why the lake is disappearing and how it's affecting migration patterns, herders' migration patterns. Hindu is now the co-chair of the International Indigenous Policy Forum that is leading the negotiations on behalf of indigenous peoples in Marrakesh that's winding up today. Another program that CI is playing a leading role in is called the Dedicated Grant Mechanism for Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities. This was a program that was negotiated between indigenous peoples, local community leaders, and the World Bank and donors that make up the Forest Investment Program in 2009. It places $80 million in the hands of indigenous communities across 14 countries, indigenous and local communities, to design and implement climate adaptation and mitigation solutions that they've come to understand have worked for them, but never have had access to determine how to move them forward. And so this project's in its second year of implementation. It's a pilot. It's one of the first experiences in which the World Bank has ever contracted directly and in some ways indirectly with indigenous communities. So it's a precedent in that regard that we will, if it succeeds, will hopefully be considered at a broader scale by funding institutions like the Green Climate Fund. CI has an Indigenous Advisory Group. It has had one since 2009 that not only advises our own leadership in the design of our strategy, but we can mobilize to advise governments in countries where we're working. Our focus on gender and indigenous work is very much joined in a way that is integrated in a lot of the work that we do in places like the Alto Mayo region in Peru, where we are focusing on empowering women in indigenous communities to conduct things like gender audits of their own work and to advise CI on how its work with indigenous people can be more gender sensitive from an indigenous lens. So in addition to that, and maybe kind of referencing what I showed earlier in terms of the Kayapo example, we know that sustainable finance for these types of solutions is going to be one of the keys going forward. In the past, CI has had a program of sustainable finance to a number of conservation initiatives, many of which have involved indigenous peoples. In this context, we've worked with a number of communities and mobilized trust funds like the one I described for the Kayapo, which we believe are the basis for solutions for scaling up finance in this new period where we're seeing emerging sources of climate finance start to consider how it can work more directly with indigenous peoples. At a local scale, we have over 51 different conservation agreements at various levels with communities that involve many of the things that Peter described in terms of consultation leading to an agreement around which an incentives program will support community-identified conservation initiatives. The core aspect of this is building the community's capacity to negotiate. The conservation agreement is small often, but maybe a stepping stone towards broader negotiating opportunities. Finally, again, I'd like to just emphasize research that has just been published by WRI, which we feel begins to add even greater momentum to the message that we'd like to leave you with, that a study that documented the fact that not only are the conservation outcomes superior in areas managed by indigenous peoples, but when you look at the costs and benefits, the costs of managing those lands versus the many, many more ecosystem services benefits that you can derive from that, it's very clear that the costs and the benefits far outweigh the costs. And it leads us to suggest that there's a solution here that is scalable at a global level. And this is perhaps some of the most compelling research that's been published recently to document that fact. So our work going forward is taking these types of solutions and working with policymakers, decision makers, financiers, and obviously empowering communities to represent themselves to scale up some of these solutions going forward. CI finds itself in the countries where we work in privileged positions as trusted advisors to help set in motion those types of negotiations. And it's evidence-based, but it's also political will-based, and it will continue to be hinge on the ability of communities of indigenous people to negotiate for themselves going forward, and we're really hopefully just setting the stage for that to be as effective as possible. So with that, I'll say thanks and conclude this presentation and invite, if we have maybe 4 or 5 minutes left, if there are any questions from the floor for any of our panelists.
If we can maybe hold the questions and we can deal with the panel during the break, I think it might be a little bit better.
Sure.
Thank you very much for this great presentation.